Welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Dennis, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology. It is a joy to welcome you to tonight's resident talk. Sitka is located at Cascade Head on the north central Oregon coast and resides on the unceded traditional lands of the indigenous people now represented by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Celeste Indians. There is much to learn as just one step that we can take, especially when we are planning to visit Sitka or the Oregon coast. We encourage you to visit the Grand Ronde Museum and Cultural Center. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the first of three residents who will be sharing their work with you tonight. Rachel Levin is a field biologist who studies communication and reproductive strategies of animals in their natural habitats. Rachel spent over 20 years in the rainforests of the Republic of Panama, studying the bay wren, a tropical bird whose males and females alternate song syllables, creating a vocal duet. Rachel earned her PhD in neurobiology and behavior at Cornell University, held postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Washington and Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and is currently the William A. Hilton Professor of Zoology at Pomona College. A slight change from the Panama landscape. This fall, Rachel spent some time in Sitka's Pacific Northwest coastal habitat. Rachel Levin, welcome to Sitka.
Thank you so much. I am so grateful to have had time in a temperate rainforest. And what I thought I'd do today is share with you some of my adventures as someone who studies the behavior of wild animals in their natural habitat and how they brought me to Sitka and what I'm thinking now as a result of that amazing experience. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see a little bit of what I'm talking about. This is me in grad school, wandering in the freshwater streams of the rainforests of lowland Panama. I was interested in animal communication. And if you're interested in animal communication, you start with birdsong, because biologists in the temperate zone have studied birdsong for decades, and they know almost everything. They think they know almost everything there is to know about birdsong. However, in the temperate zone, only male birds sing. And if you go down to the tropics, females of most species also sing. And this is meaningful because over 85% of the world's bird species live in the tropics. So we've been studying the exception rather than the rule. And further, in about 200 species of tropical birds, males and females coordinate their songs in vocal duets. Well, this sounded really cool to me. At the time, nobody was really studying tropical bird song, and I really, really, really wanted to go to the tropical rainforest. So here I am, wandering the rainforest in central Panama in sort of secondary growth where a lot of songbirds tend to live. And the birds that I was after were these guys. These are bay wrens. This is a male, this is a female. As you can tell, they don't particularly look different. The female's just being kind of chill in this particular picture. And when I found them, the first thing I had to do was catch them, which one does in very finely meshed volleyball nets, essentially, and give each of them unique combinations of colored plastic leg bands so I could tell them apart. I also surgically sexed them and then released them back into the wild. Then I followed them all around with an amazingly archaic, heavy analog tape recorder. This was the 80s, folks, trying to record their duets. And what immediately became clear was that they were singing duets. This is a picture of such a duet with pitch on the y-axis from low to high, and this is time on the horizontal axis. Okay, you probably heard three phrases, three repetitions of a single phrase, and unless you were standing between the two birds, you would have no way of knowing that that was a duet. So here, I show you that the female was starting this duet. Her part of the phrase is in pink, sorry about that. She sings two unique notes, and she's answered by the male with repeated notes in a trill-like thing. So let me play that again. So you can begin to hear what it sounds like. They're really loud. And I can also tell you, each pair of duets has a repertoire of duets, and in each one, the female sings the leading part with 2 or 3 unique notes, and the male sings some repeated notes in a trill to answer her. I put my entire graduate career into figuring out that females are singing simply to keep other females off their territories. They don't really care if males answer them. Males, on the other hand, are interspersing their notes with hers in order to indicate that the singing female is taken, that she belongs to them. So this is not the little love song cooperative venture that people originally thought. But after grad school, I was left with a question, which I didn't expect, which was, what about the sex differences in song? Why do females lead? Why do males sing trills? So the first thing I thought of doing was collaborating with a friend to look at the bird brains and bird hormones to see if that was the origin of the sex differences. Now, I told you we know a lot about temperate bird song, and that's all in males, remember. And what we found is that male bird brains come with these very neatly colored and labeled parts, which are song control regions. And they are turned on by the hormone testosterone, which is abundant in males and low in females in the temperate zone. Females don't have these song centers, or they're really, really small. So what did our bay wrens have? We found that males and females had essentially identical song control regions, equal size, equal cell density. We also found no difference in the hormone levels, testosterone, that turns on the song control regions in males and females. So the origin of sex differences couldn't be neuroanatomical or endocrine. However, we also found that the hormone levels of our tropical birds were really, really low, suggesting they didn't even potentially need them. So I did the unthinkable and I took gonads out of tropical birds, and I found that they still sang without any hormones whatsoever. So that was a mystery. So we now have 2 mysteries. 1, where do sex differences come from? And 2, what the heck is going on with tropical birds? So when I came to Pomona College as a young professor, my hair was not gray then, I decided to look to see if these birds were learning their song. And we know that many temperate songbird males learn their songs from their dads. So this is a newly hatched bay wren chick. And I took bay wren chicks and eggs and I flew them on commercial airlines to my lab at Pomona College. And I hand reared each one in an individual acoustic isolation cage. And in each cage over here, you can see a speaker. And from that speaker, we broadcast bay wren duets to each little chick. All they could hear was that tape. They couldn't hear each other. And this was a full duet with the female and male parts. So if they learn to sing from listening to others, they have to figure out how to sing like a bay wren and which part to learn. So what did they learn? They learned to sing the entire thing. Here are 3 sample birds, Dot, No Dot, and Balboa, each of whom copied the full duet and sang it in its entirety, sometimes with a little embellishment. So what this told us is, yeah, they learn how to sing like a wren, but they have no clue who they are. To look further at that, we separated the speakers in each cage, putting the male part on one side and the female part on the other. And then occasionally they would sing the appropriate part, but usually they always sang full duets. So the end of this part of the story is that it is definitely a learned behavior, but it requires social interactions that our lab-raised birds didn't have for the birds to figure out who they are. So that leaves me with the second question, which leads me closer to Sitka. And that is what was going on with the hormone-free tropical birds, if you will. And this led me to look into the literature, and I found that there are a lot of assumptions about the difference between temperate and tropical birds. Among them, that tropical birds are monogamous, they produce fewer eggs per nest, it takes those tropical kids, longer to hatch, longer to leave the nest, and they suffer high predation rates, and I'm adding the hormone result. Now, the problem with all of this work is that nobody's done it on a single species. They compare temperate zone robins to tropical whatever swallows, and So they're comparing apples to oranges. But if you study house wrens, a relative of bay wrens, you have the benefit that they are nasty, aggressive, surviving little birds, but they breed from Alaska all the way down through Central America to the tip of Tierra del Fuego. So we studied them where it was convenient here in California, in the highlands and lowlands, and we also studied them in Costa Rica, in the cloud forest and the lowland rainforests. And there are colleagues in other universities who are studying them in the South Temperate Zone. So what did we find? Well, first, we had to put up nest boxes to attract all these whole nesting birds so we could keep track of how many eggs they laid and how many chicks survived. This is just a monitor to monitor the comings and goings of the parents in the nest. So the first thing we looked at was monogamy. Long story short, remember, tropical birds were supposed to be monogamous and temperate birds are not. And that's true if you just watch them. In California, you can follow a single banded male and see that he's attending to more than one female in more than one nest. So that I call social polygyny. In Costa Rica, however, males only had one social mate and they looked like they were completely dedicated. But if you look at their DNA to look at who is fathering chicks in each of the nests, in addition to being socially polygynous, you find that in the lowland, almost all of the males are being cheated on by their mate. And similarly in the mountains. What about in Costa Rica, where they only have one social mate? Turns out that guy is helping, in 25% of the cases, males are helping raise kids that aren't their own. And it's a little higher in the mountains. So tropical birds are socially monogamous, but they cheat. So don't trust a tropical bird as your mate. What about reproductive biology? This is what we would expect from the temperate zone. The temperate zone birds, where they're studied always east of the Rockies in Illinois, Ohio, New York, Kentucky, they lay about 6 eggs every time they nest. They take 12 days to hatch and about 2 weeks for the young hatchlings to leave the nest. We expect differences with our tropical birds, and here they are. In the lowlands in light green, the highlands in dark green, tropical birds always lay fewer eggs than most temperate studies found. They take longer to hatch and longer to fledge, which is exactly what the literature suggested. But this is all on one species now. Here are birds in the highlands in California and the eastern Sierras. And yes, they lay more eggs, they hatch faster, but possibly because it was 7,000 feet and really cold up there, they take longer to leave the nest. But the real clincher and the biggest surprise was the local birds here near the desert of Southern California. They lay lots of eggs, but otherwise they act like tropical birds. So they lay lots of eggs, but they have retained the tropical slow-mo lifestyle. Reviewers didn't believe it when I tried to publish this, and they said, you've got to throw those data out. Those birds are really weird. And that's a strange thing for a reviewer to say. So I'm here to recruit you. Take advantage of this seminar. Here you are in Oregon. Here's where I studied the birds in Southern California. If we really want to understand temperate versus tropical birds, we're really saying what environmental factors guide or influence reproductive behavior. We need more diversity. Specifically, there are house wrens in the Sitka area. There are house wrens out here in the desert. Everybody else studies them over here. We need to be studying them everywhere. So when you are in your backyard, particularly if you're on the edge of disturbed habitat or on a river edge, you will likely find one of two wrens, the really dark, bold, very handsome wrens, or the washed out house wren. You want the washed out one? And here's what they sound like. They are relentless singers for the first hour of the day. They will sing every 5 seconds for 2 hours until you almost kill them. So if you hear such a bird, I would love to hear from you. This is my email. I would love to send you a nest box and you get to watch them breed and tell me what they do. So I want to thank everyone at Sitka. This is the view from my window, which I miss so much, and I see outside of Sam's window. Thank you to the staff at Sitka, and a special thank you to my buds in residency, Sam, Celeste, and Nancy. You guys are great. I really miss you already.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing your work with us tonight. Our second presenter this evening is Sam Kim. Sam is a Brooklyn-based experimental choreographer and dancer who has been making and performing in dances for over 2 decades. Informed by her immigrant experience as a Korean American, Sam's body of work resolutely pushes into the margins of dance, celebrating the edges while courting the danger inherent in rejecting dance's legacies. Kim approaches her choreographic practice as an artistic game of brinkmanship. Her work has been commissioned and presented by venues such as The Kitchen, Performance Space 122, Dance Space Project, and The Chocolate Factory. She was recently awarded the Van Cleef and Arpels Special Fellowship in Choreography for her upcoming residency at the Bogliasco Center. Sam Kim, we are so glad that you are here and dancing in between the raindrops at Sitka. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Allison. Thanks to all of you at Sitka. And it's really great to be here. So I want to use the lion's share of my time to actually show my work so you all can have a direct experience with it. And I'll just say a bit about my creative process after you've seen excerpts of my work. So the first clip I'm going to show is from a piece called Procession. It was a commissioned work for Xenon Dance Company, which was based in Minneapolis, and it premiered at the Kohl's Center in Minneapolis in 2018. So I'll just show you a few minutes in the middle, and then I'm going to cut to the end. So I think procession is a really good example of me trying to be amenable to the current working conditions that present themselves as they're unfolding in real time, whatever kind of framework I'm working in, whether that be whatever rehearsal space or the ultimate performance venue or, say, a residency context. Yeah, I just really like to be very honest about what the conditions are. So that includes truly seeing my environment for what it is and being sensitive to it and taking cues from it. So in the case with procession, we talk about those mats. They were actually, I saw them out of the corner of my eye in the studio that we were working in, and it was just this high stack of tumbling mats. And I thought, this is great because I have a very weird fetish for athletic apparatus like gymnastics equipment, the uneven bars, tumbling mats, crash mats. I like the way that climbing holds look in climbing gyms. So I think all these things are really quite beautiful as objects in and of themselves. And then I just wonder what it is to then think of them as not animate per se, but kind of working with them as dance partners. So I don't know. I think procession is kind of me delighting in a certain kind of geometry, if you will. So I think the piece occupies this interesting sort of slippery place between what is human body and what are its constraints, what is the body of a tumbling mat, what are its constraints, and then what is that space in between when they collide and you're working out some kind of relationship between bodies and objects. Yeah, so I think that's a really good example of how I like to work in terms of making friends and being amenable to the conditions that are the true working conditions. I also want to talk about how other things arose in that process too. Like the actual movement was generated from improvisational scores. And depending on kind of the temperament of the performers that I'm working with, it's just a form of play. I just give them sort of questions about working with a kind of density. This group was so valiant, I asked them to do so much literal heavy lifting of each other's bodies. And I was just really interested in how there was sort of this tension of like the amount of tension and energy they would have to exert to just kind of haul their bodies up into space and sort of do these deadlifts. And then I asked them to sort of extract the body and still imagine that they were holding up, yeah, each other's bodies. And I got more interested in sort of the subtraction of the body and the result that that yielded. So that's how movement kind of came about. There's a lot of play in the studio, a lot of jokes. I also had to work with certain constraints. In the clip that you saw, there were some lights on the ground, and those are traditional psych lights that are never really meant to be seen. But because of other pieces that were on the program, folks were using them, so I couldn't strip them. So I decided, okay, well, I'm really going to use them and I'm really going to expose them. So I decided to sort of create a different relationship. They were going to be exposed, and I sort of wanted them to sing, if you will. So that's why they're kind of flashing and blinking at certain times. Okay, and I will now show you a long improvisation from residency I was just at called Shadowcliff. It's brand new, it's fantastic. I was there in September for a few weeks. And the working space I was given was the chapel on campus. So the specificity of the space, again, working with conditions that just kind of unfold in real time, were just so rich. The space is so rich and specific and atmospheric to me. So I will set that up and So yeah, I even in watching that again and kind of considering it, I really did not have a specific score in mind going into that improvisation, but I felt that there was so much richness of information with that atmosphere and that specific space. It felt very charged up. And also, bonus, I don't know if anybody could see a delicious bonus. There were orbs flying around in that footage. For instance, the way that the chairs were placed in that space, I don't have any recollection as to whether or not I might have moved them myself just to make more space, or if maybe there was an event in there before I rehearsed the next time. But I like very much where those chairs are. I loved where they landed. They strongly imply that there's spectators in that space. And I was thinking spectators, and then I was thinking specters, and I was then thinking specters of spectators, and what did it mean to perform with that kind of lens and that framework. And I think also the windows were really important to me, and the fact that it was night and there was a sense of being seen, but maybe one shouldn't really be seeing that. So kind of a voyeuristic aspect, if you will, even though it has a real sense of kind of privacy and ritual. And then I also want to make a comment that actually the very next day was the last workshop we did for the residency. And I did actually perform outside of the chapel on the point, which is just this rocky outlook. And I did a slow revolve on a very rustic wooden bench. And I remember the folks who were viewing the performance were actually inside the chapel, and they were lit. So when I kind of looked up and I was outside looking at them in the chapel, I just loved it. I just thought, oh my God, it's so weird. They think they're looking at me, but I'm really looking at them. So yeah, something about the way that the material is viewed. There are multiple lenses, and I like holding the simultaneity of all of them. My process is just becoming more rugged and elemental and spare. And then definitely as I'm here at Sitka and so much in this like outsized, beautiful, natural, rugged landscape, it just kind of encourages that kind of thinking. I just want to be as spacious as possible at this time. In the process and in the dances that ultimately manifest, I think I really seek attunement and alignment with performers, viewers, and the specificity of a certain space and place. So I think dance is still super enthralling and exciting to me in that I think it offers a fiercely alive and embodied experience. So that is it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sam. I often say that my favorite thing about these talks is just what coincidentally ends up getting juxtaposed with what. And there's just something really invigorating about Rachel taking us inside the design constraints of a science experiment over time, and you taking us inside the design constraints of your dance making process within place-based constraints. It really is my favorite part of these talks. So thank you, both of you. And we've got one more. So our last presenter tonight is Celeste Noche. Celeste is a Filipino-American editorial and documentary photographer based between Portland, Oregon, and San Francisco, California, specializing in food, travel, and portraiture. Using a mix of digital, medium format, 35 millimeter, and instant film photography, Celeste's work documents the legacies of forced migration, assimilation, and how we change with displacement. The mix of photographic mediums is a callback to the mementos her family lost upon fleeing the Philippines and their continued displacement after settling in America. Her work has been published in NPR, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. She is the founder of Portland in Color, a collective highlighting Black, Indigenous, and other creatives of color in Portland. Sitka community, please join me in welcoming Celeste Noche to the Sitka Center.
Hi, thank you for having me. So good to be in such great company. I just wanted to share, I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about. My film is not ready from the lab, so I don't have any of that from my time to share. And actually, I wasn't there to take photos. I was working on a different project, but I thought I would use this time to talk about access in art and photography. And I do think there's a connection somewhere, but I'll just get into it a little bit with what I have. So, just to start, I'm a photographer. I am a photojournalist. And so it's really interesting to be in this space because I think like my work is kind of a Venn diagram of photojournalism and art. And there are times when they both feel really connected and obvious, and sometimes when they don't feel connected at all. But I do think that there's an art to photojournalism, and I think there's something very documentary and real about the way we see art and photography. I've been freelancing for 10 years this year, which is incredible because when I first started, I thought, surely I will not be able to pay my bills this way. But here we are a decade later, and it has worked out. Woohoo. I specialize in food travel and portraiture. I didn't really have any examples of what being a photographer could be like growing up. So it wasn't even a career that I thought was feasible to me. Growing up, I didn't know any creatives. I didn't know that that was the thing that you could do. And that kind of brings me back to this idea of access and what you see when you're a kid. Like, if you don't ever see that anyone can be an artist as a profession, then it's not something that you maybe will imagine for yourself. But I will go into a little bit more of that later. Here is some of my work that is not Sitka specific, but some of my portraiture, some of my earliest. I started with like a lot of wedding work, which is fine in its own sense, but the work that really felt like I was creating work that felt like me and felt meaningful was when I started documenting the community of creatives that I found when I first came to Portland. I moved up from San Francisco and I experienced gatekeeping when I didn't really know what gatekeeping was. So getting into the industry was really tough for me. And it wasn't until I started being in community with and collaborating with different artists of color in Portland did I really feel supported and like I was sort of finding my footing and my voice in this realm. Portland, like statistically, is known as not a very diverse major city, but I also learned that being in this community, that even just by only talking about that, you're erasing the people who are there doing incredible work in the vibrant communities that do exist. So my first kind of like actual overlap of art and photojournalism was this, at the time, photo project called Portland in Color, where I was documenting my community, and a local street paper called Street Roots learned about it and profiled me. And that's how I started my first assignments as a photojournalist. I didn't go to photojournalism school. I didn't have any of that background, but because a local paper was interested in having a conversation and we talked about things, they started commissioning me for work. And over time, I started to do projects for other newspapers. I grew up in San Francisco, so to be able to photograph things for the San Francisco Chronicle, which was like my paper growing up, was like really incredible. And especially documenting communities, specifically around food, was really important to me. And sort of the art of seeing my communities in a way that felt like a reflection of them and being part of those communities versus that perspective of like an outsider looking in. My friend Lena is actually that person with the two kiddos next to her, and she wrote a column about immigrant food stories. And actually, the Chronicle wouldn't hire me. So this is, again, coming back to the idea of access. I wasn't an established photojournalist. The Chronicle wouldn't hire me. So Lena actually insisted on paying me out of pocket so that I would be her photographer for her column until the Chronicle finally agreed to do it, to hire me. And then, of course, my photos were on the covers of their section. So they obviously thought like the work was good enough. But when you think about the barriers to entry, sometimes it takes one person to really believe in you to access those spaces. But before then, you're sort of met with a lot of walls. Think about who has access to these industries. How do we have diverse voices in these fields if they're constantly coming up against access points like that? I did a project about mobile libraries in the Outer Hebrides, and so it felt cool to work on stuff back home, but then travel to remote islands in Scotland to document people living in remote areas and the resources for them there. I wanted to talk about the early legacy of photography and how that relates to the photography we see today and this idea of access. Photography is often seen as a connector of shared experiences. Everyone is a photographer now. Everyone has a camera on their phone in their pockets, but it's also important to talk about the earliest uses of photography, who had access to cameras and those resources, and what those photos were used for. This blog post by Zara Chaudhry is an example of the ways photography was used in a really harmful manner. It's my cat Frank, who has some thoughts to say about this. And when we see some of the earliest examples of photography, it was actually used as a way to justify things like colonization, imperialism, a way of othering. And so it's interesting to think about the way we use photography now as a tool of connection and of art, but how it was used in such a harmful way in its earliest uses. It's disturbing actually to me to see images like this, because in a way that, in something that could have been really beautiful in documenting such an array of different cultures and backgrounds, we see examples of photos that were used ultimately to justify like racism and white supremacy. These two portraits actually really were difficult for me because they're of like a Filipino man and woman, but we don't actually have the information about where exactly they were from that I was able to find for this. And then when we see these sort of like befores and afters, this diptych is actually really interesting to me because it's the same person, but in the after photo, his skin is magically much lighter. And I don't know if that was like a darkroom situation, because I don't know how someone's skin tone can change that much. But to me, this is like an interesting thing to think about and important to remember as we think about photography as a medium, because I think we still continue to see the legacy of that today. And so maybe we're not using photos in that example, but when we think about photojournalism and as we see it now, we see it, the legacy of it, in some of our most iconic and well-recognized photos that we know. This photograph is very well known from National Geographic. In fact, the person who was photographed in it didn't even know the photo was taken. It wasn't taken with her consent. She didn't know that it was a world-renowned, award-winning photograph until almost more than 20 years later. And so we see this issue of access. It's not just who has access to take photos, but how are people using photography as a means to access other people and share them, and in what contexts? And to me, it exemplifies and is a continuation of the sense of entitlement we see in the earliest uses of photography. I'm not going to show the photo of Phan Thi Kim Phuc from the Vietnam War, but she famously was in a photo called Napalm Girl. And that was like a life-altering moment that not only was impactful for her as a person, but in the war and how we see things. And so I really appreciated this quote from her, which says, "Photographs by definition capture a moment in time, but the surviving people in these photographs, especially the children, must somehow go on. And we are not symbols, we are human." And so when we're thinking about this overlap of photojournalism and art, I think I always come back to the humanity of it. And what are we saying with our photographs? What are we coming back to? What are the messages we're sharing? A lot of people talk about like representation, and I think that has a place, but I'm actually more interested in a broader conversation. It's not just who we're seeing in front of the camera, but who are we making space for behind the camera? Access is also about who are we giving the tools and the resources so that we can see their perspectives too. An organization I'm part of called Women Photograph does an annual survey of how many A1 photos, and for anyone that doesn't know, A1s are like sort of the front page photos, but how many of them are taken by women and non-binary photographers. And I think even in the most recent data, I don't think it's breached 30%. So of all of the publications that exist, the front pages that we see every day, less than 30% of them are not taken by women and non-binary photographers. What does that mean about the world and the way we see it, and the news that we're consuming, and how we see things? When we limit who has access to the tools and resources to thrive in these professions and these fields, we limit the perspectives that and the nuance that we could be looking at the world stories with. This award-winning photograph was really interesting to me because it is actually a man who has visited a lot of places where there's food insecurity and asks them to pose with fake food. And so there's an element of art into it, but to me, it comes with like at the cost of a lot of insensitivity. And it again, it brings the question of perspective. Lastly, I'll just bring up Portland was at the center of a lot of press coverage during the 2020 social justice protests. And in the Columbia Journalism Review, someone interviewed photographers about what they saw on the ground, and yet none of those photographers were Black. And so this is a question that I'm constantly coming back to. I'm thinking about how are we making space for people in these fields? Like, are we pushing back so that the perspectives that we are seeing aren't just from the same demographics, that we're not limiting our worldview to something that only represents some of us. I will leave this for you to read, but I do think that not just in media, but in art as well, it is our responsibility to create space and allow artists to flourish. But to me, being at Sitka and having access to these resources to be an artist and have the space to really practice and focus on my own well-being and not merely on output was really powerful to me. When I started freelancing, I didn't even know what an artist residency was. And I think that means a lot when you think about access, because if we're going to create space for people in these spaces and they don't even know what the opportunities are, like there's a barrier that exists. And so I'm grateful to be in this space that's focused on an artist's creative practice or process, no matter what that looks like, and with their well-being at their forefront. To me, it creates an ecosystem where anyone can belong. And so I will always love my time at this gorgeous estuary house with a fireplace. I learned how to make a fire. I'm very proud. It took me a very long time. Just being in connection with the tides and letting nature and my current environment inform my work, not feeling like I was falling behind because I wasn't in front of my computer, but knowing that being in nature was important to my process. Nancy and I were really obsessed with catching crabs towards the last little bits of our time. And we actually, one of our first meals that I made with Nancy was making sinigang, which is a Filipino sour soup. And so sharing that with fellow residents to me was really important because my project was about my mom. And so to make culturally important food connected to the land and see where we were, while also thinking about the legacy of my mom's journey for my project was really powerful. On our tour with Jake, we collected all these beautiful mushrooms, some chanterelles and cauliflower mushrooms. And I'm just so thankful to have connected with other artists who I love and admire so much, just to be in nature together. It's really hard to see, but Rachel is tiny in the middle. If you look closely, you can see Sam with her braids harvesting mussels. She's truly incredible. And here, Sam, Nancy, and I are at God's thumb with our thumbs ups. So I just wanted to say thank you to Sitka for this opportunity and to be engaged with this community, and also for the opportunity to bring my family there, because I know not a lot of artist residencies create that kind of space. And I think that if we want a future in arts, we need to think about access across what that means in all types of forms of access. And my favorite photo ever now is of my sweet guy reading Calvin and Hobbes in this window nook at the estuary house. I'm so glad that he gets to grow up knowing what artist residencies are and what being part of creative communities are. So I'll just leave you, I want to leave you on that, but I will leave you with this question: what could the world look like if we were to prioritize access? We can just go back to Theo because he's so cute. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be part of this community. I'm looking forward to continuing to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Celeste, for sharing your perspective and taking us inside your work and your residency. Thanks, Celeste, Rachel, and Sam for all presenting tonight. We also want to give a special shout out to Casey McKinney, a visual artist and professor of urban studies at Portland State University, and to Michael Hansen, a photographer and filmmaker, who were both previously scheduled to be here with us this evening and needed to change their plans for personal reasons. Casey and Michael, we're so pleased to have you as part of the Sitka community, and we send our best wishes out to you and your families. Thank you, Sitka community, for tuning in tonight. We look forward to seeing you again on Tuesday, December 10. Good night, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.